So we move now to Chapter 8 in our textbook about the practices of journalism. This is a continuation of our discussion of Chapter 4, Ink on Paper, in which we looked at the media platforms that are associated with print, the books, newspapers, and magazines trilogy, the forms of mass media that have been around for almost 500 years. So we're going to continue in Chapter 8 with a little bit of history. But it's an important piece of history because of the fact that it established a really important legal precedent in mass media. So we're focusing on the period of time before the United States was actually the United States. This is at a time when the colonies have been founded in the early 1700s, but we have yet to undergo that process that united us into the USA in the late 1770s. So let's get underway with this particular piece of business from the mid-1730s. This is discussed, by the way, on page 208 of your textbook. We're going to focus our attention on a newspaper publisher whose name was John Peter Zenger. Now, what is important about Zenger's history is that in 1733, the colonial government, the colonial governor of New York, had Zenger arrested, and the charge levied against him was that of seditious libel. Now, let's put this preface to the discussion. Look at that word L-I-B-E-L, and notice that it consists of 5 letters and not 6. I don't want you to confuse the 5-letter word libel with the 6-letter word liable. You know, like, I don't know, after you finish listening to this lesson, you're liable to go get something to eat. So am I, for that matter. But that's not the libel that we're talking about. Libel, in this context, is an aspect of American mass media that we discuss in much greater detail later in the semester. In Chapter 16, we have quite a lengthy lesson associated with that, but for purposes of our discussion in Chapter 8, we need to understand that libel is using the power of the mass media to deliver words or information that can defame or deprive another person of the right to their good name, to say things about them that cause people to think less highly of them simply because the information that has been printed or perhaps broadcast has somehow defamed this person. Defamation has occurred. Well, that's what Zenger did. He published information that the colonial governor thought defamed him. The governor thought that as people read this information in the newspaper, they would think less highly of him, probably give him less political support, maybe even consider revolution against him. So the easiest way for the governor to control this situation was to have the newspaper publisher tucked away safely in a jail cell, so there would be no future editions that could cause the governor a problem. So what's the important aspect of this story? The important thing to remember is that John Peter Zenger was given a trial, and during this trial, as his defense, he argued the fact that every bit of the information about the colonial governor that he published in that newspaper was true. There was no rumor, there was no opinion, it was all fact, and all of the facts were true. And so as a result of that, because the defamation that might occur to the colonial governor was based on actual truth, the jury acquitted Zenger, and it established the legal precedence that is still important today, and that is that when the mass media deliver content to us that may be controversial, may be even considered possibly defamatory, the fact is, if what is published is true, then we have freedom of the press. No two ways about it. This applies just as completely to the broadcast media as it does to the print media, as it would online. one of the most important legal precedents of the American mass media is that we have freedom of the press. If the information is true, we, as citizens of the U.S., can publish it without any concern about the repercussions of putting that information out there. So hang on to that idea. We'll come back to it again when we get into Chapter 16 later in the semester. Continuing our stroll down history lane, let's talk about the newspapering business in the United States in the very early, or some of the earlier years of the history of our country. The period from roughly the 1830s to the 1880s or so, considered to be the penny press period of American newspaper history, and I bet that you can probably figure out where that phrase comes from, because in fact, thanks to the Industrial Revolution of the early 1830s, particularly with the invention of the rotary press that we talked about back in Chapter 2, it became possible with that new type of printing press to print thousands of copies of a newspaper in a relatively short period of time. And again, because there is economy of scale in producing so many copies, the newspaper publisher found that their expense was reduced, and as a result, they could drop the price of the newspaper from a dime or a nickel and sell it for a penny. And of course, what's important about that is the fact that many people of less privileged means who might in years past have been unable to afford to buy a newspaper, now with the price set at 1 penny, they can afford to purchase the newspaper. The newspaper of this era, the penny press newspapers, really become a mass medium. Mass production helps to ensure that this takes place. A mass medium, the ability to disseminate news and information to a large, widespread group of readers, rather than the smaller and more confined group of newspaper readers that was characterized by the papers of the late 1700s and early 1800s. Particularly in some of the large cities on the East Coast, and in particular of those, New York City, these were places that were home to thousands of immigrants who came to the United States in the mid-1800s. And as poor as they might have been, they were able to scrape together enough money on occasion to purchase one of these penny newspapers. They liked them because there was a lot of emphasis on human interest stories. And as new Americans who have come to the United States, many of them from Europe, they seemed to relate well to these kinds of stories that evoked a lot of emotion and sentiment. Another product of the mid-1800s is the Associated Press, and my guess is that you probably have heard of the AP before, particularly those of you who are sports fans and might associate it, let's say, with the AP college football poll. Well, that's important to some football fans, but I want you to understand that the Associated Press is much more than just an organization that rates college football teams. What it is, simply, is a group of journalists, initially at newspapers back in the mid-1800s, who found that it was much easier to get newspaper stories out of distant locations by using or by collaborating to send one reporter to a location, observe what was going on, and then write a news story that would be sent to newspapers in multiple locations. And the best example of this in the earliest days was in the 1860s during the Civil War in the United States, and when many of the battles that were being fought from Pennsylvania and on southward, some of the large cities in the upper Northeast, for example, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, found that they could pool their resources, employ one reporter, send this reporter southward to the battlefields, and then that one reporter could prepare one story and send it to the editors of the newspapers in Boston and New York and Washington, Philadelphia. And there was economy of scale achieved by doing this. Each newspaper did not have to send and pay the expense of supporting their own individual reporter. And so the Associated Press, long after the Civil War had come to an end, continued to evolve. And today it is, I would suspect, the largest independent news gathering cooperative in the world. What you see on the screen, by the way, is a screenshot I captured of their home page. No, I take that back. It's not the home page. From the home page, I went to the, and I'll put the mouse pointer here, to the About Us page. And you can get a quick history of the Associated Press by going out to their website and following it to this link and then scrolling down the page. Here's the real focus of Chapter 8, as far as I see things, and that's on that period of newspapering that was happening in New York City, in the United States, in the late 1800s. We're going to focus on that era, and I'm going to ask you to watch a video presentation about this gentleman, Joseph Pulitzer, because his story just really helps to understand what the business of newspapering was in the late 1800s and set the groundwork for what news reporting has become even to this day. Joe Pulitzer, as a young, lanky Hungarian immigrant to the United States, came to fight as a mercenary soldier during the Civil War. Didn't find that to his liking, and so it didn't take him long to leave the military, and of all places, he wound up in St. Louis. St. Louis, at the time of Joe Pulitzer, in the 1860s and 1870s, was a growing city. If I'm not mistaken, I believe St. Louis might have been, around the time of Joseph Pulitzer, the second or third largest city in the United States. The huge German immigrant population in St. Louis resulted in several, I don't know exactly how many, but several daily newspapers in the city, and all were published in the German language. Joe Pulitzer became an investor in some of these newspapers, and just to cut to the chase, it wasn't too many years after his arrival in St. Louis that he bought two newspapers, the Westchester Post and the St. Louis Dispatch, and merged the two and founded the newspaper that still exists today and is regarded as one of the nation's great newspapers, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. The Pulitzer family, the descendants of old Joe Pulitzer, owned and operated this newspaper for the better part of probably 70 years or so. The family does not own the newspaper today. Joe Pulitzer was interesting. He was, pardon the expression, but he was a scrawny chap. His health was not good. He had a severe aversion to noise. He was nearly blind for most of his adult life, and it made for an interesting family situation for Joe and his, how many sons? I think 3 sons and 2 daughters, a rather large family for that time. He leaves St. Louis, winds up in New York City in the early 1800s, and buys a newspaper that had been struggling, the New York World. The New York World was a newspaper that at the time that Pulitzer acquired it, was one that appealed to persons of education and wealth. In other words, the upper middle class were the readers of this newspaper. Now, Joe Pulitzer, as an immigrant to the United States, understood very well the plight of being a person, let's say, coming from Italy, coming from Great Britain or Ireland, France, Germany, people coming to the United States with very little financial support, looking for a better life in this new world, and he knew the problems that they faced stepping off the ship and into the harbor in New York and becoming an American citizen. And so he used his newspaper, the New York World, muchly for the, is muchly a word? I don't know why I said that. He used his newspaper for helping to advance the Americanization of the immigrants from Europe. How about that? He taught them how to be American. In addition to news stories, there were human interest stories, as we talked about earlier. There were articles in there about how to act and dress like an American, showing women hairstyles and fashions, and showing men grooming tips. He used his newspaper to help the immigrants become American citizens. It's not simply enough just to be introduced as a citizen through the citizenship process. He was teaching them how to act and be and think like Americans. A really interesting person. But, and this is a big but, his competition in New York was a newspaper publisher by the name of William Randolph Hearst. Hearst comes from the West Coast, comes from a very wealthy family, and Hearst and his newspaper in New York City gave great competition to Joe Pulitzer and his newspaper. It's a little bit hard to describe just how competitive these two businessmen were in using their newspapers to reach out to the people of New York City and beyond. Newspapers at this point became very scandalous. If you think about some of the tabloid newspapers that you would see today at the supermarket checkout line, and I'm talking those small tabloid newspapers like the National Enquirer or the Midnight Globe or the Tatler, the ones that have the really interesting stories on the front about space aliens coming to the United States. Those are tabloids. That's sensationalistic journalism. And it had its origins, had its beginnings in the era of Pulitzer and Hearst. The stories were, they stretched the truth to points beyond believable means. And after a period of time, the style of journalism that Pulitzer and Hearst practiced in their newspapers became known as yellow journalism. And that yellow journalism was because each of the newspapers in their comic strips, their funny pages, if you will, had a cartoon character named the Yellow Kid. And you'll understand more about this Yellow Kid when you look at the video. But nonetheless, the Yellow Kid represented probably one of the lowest points in accurate newspaper reporting in the history of our country. Sensationalism, the exaggeration, the bending the truth. And it just, I guess to some extent for people, it made for entertaining reading, but it didn't do much to inform the public about government affairs or what was going on in their world, and certainly did not do much to elevate education. So, let me summarize some of the key points about Pulitzer before you watch the video. He comes to New York City. He purchases The World, a newspaper that initially appealed to upper-class citizens. Pulitzer turns it around. He reorients the content and makes it a newspaper that appeals to immigrants and teaches them how to become Americans. One of the persons that he employs, and hey, this is pretty significant for the time, he employs Nellie Bly. Now, what's significant about this is that there are very few female news reporters, very few female journalists who are working in the United States. And she was considered to be an intrepid and very wily reporter. She engaged, well, I don't need to tell you things that you'll see about in the video, and read about in the book for that matter. So let me encourage you to be on the lookout for information about Nellie Bly. I've already mentioned the Yellow Kid, the comic strip character. It was as a result of his popularity that the newspapers acquired the nickname of practicing yellow journalism, which again merely means how sensationalistic their reporting has become. There's a saying that every good thing comes to an end, comes to pass, and that is certainly true for old Joe Pulitzer's New York World newspaper. From the 1880s until somewhere in the mid-1930s, a span of roughly, 45 or 50 years, and the newspaper has pretty much run its cycle at that point. The world has sort of, by the time of the 1930s, we've gone through the Great Depression when so many people went bust financially. The circulation began to drop off because of the Great Depression. The newspaper publishers hiked the price of the newspaper, and all of a sudden people who thought nothing about paying, let's say, 2 cents for a newspaper were thinking twice about paying 3 cents or 4 cents, and many quit buying. The children of Joe Pulitzer, particularly his male children, who were involved, some of them in operating the newspaper, soon moved away, and others of his sons had no interest at all in the newspaper business. And so because of the general lack of interest by his heirs, the world just sort of went into decline and lost its prominence in New York City as one of America's great newspapers. So I hope you enjoy this video. Please look for it out on the homepage of Moodle, and you'll learn more about Joe. Let's move ahead to Chapter 8, to pages 215 through 217, and talk about a phenomenon called gatekeeping in the news. What are the responsibilities of a gatekeeper as a journalist? Well, let's see if we can define that. And we'll talk about the gatekeeper's responsibility to the news hole in the process. A gatekeeper, as we define it in the mass media, is a term that you can apply to any person or any person in a particular job in the mass media who has the responsibility and the authority to decide which content is allowed to pass on to consumers and which content isn't. Now, let's think about that for just a moment. An editor, by definition, is a gatekeeper. An editor decides out of all the things that happen in the world today, all of the different stories that reporters follow and cover and write news stories about, the editor decides which of those stories pass on to the newspaper or to the radio and television broadcast and which ones don't. There certainly is not enough time or personnel or resources to report on everything that happens in the world every day that might be newsworthy. And conversely, I suspect that most of us wouldn't be interested in trying to learn about all of that. So gatekeepers take on this responsibility of determining what gets into the news and what doesn't. Now, editors, as I said, are one form of gatekeeper, but there are many other gatekeeping responsibilities that happen in the news. Think about this. Think about being a photographer. You take out your smartphone, you turn on the camera feature, you look in the back at the display of what the camera lens is seeing, and you decide how to frame the image in the picture. Maybe you move in closer so that the detail is more pronounced. Or maybe you shift from one side or another to take something out of the picture that was in it, or to put something in the frame that wasn't there before. Every move represents a purposeful decision, a conscious decision that you've made about what you want to see in the finished product, in the picture, and what you don't want to see. And every decision is a gatekeeping decision. The gatekeeping, by the way, comes from the idea of the gate and the fence. And if you're the person in charge of the gate and you're operating the swinging gate, you can decide when to close the gate and not allow something to pass through, or when to open the gate and allow it to pass. So gatekeepers exist in all areas of the mass media. Somebody has to decide, for example, which TV programs are shown to the American public and which aren't. Somebody has to decide which songs an artist records and which songs perhaps they don't. So gatekeeping exists in all of the different areas. I said that we'd tie this responsibility to the news hole, and let's apply this specifically to the newspaper. We could talk about in terms of radio or TV, but let's hold this discussion for right now to newspapering. And if you stop and think about the process of publishing a newspaper, well, that's ink on paper plain paper, and each day, at some point in the day, somebody has to start making decisions about what is going to be printed on the pages of the next day's newspaper. The very first things that get laid out on the page, if you will, get designed in the computer to be printed on the page, are those pieces of content that bring in the money to the newspaper. In other words, the paid advertising from the local and national advertisers. So if you can picture maybe an entire page of a newspaper, and on that single page, there might be 2 or 3 different display ads that take up, let's say, maybe 60% of the space. Well, that leaves 40% of the white space of the paper that has been not occupied by advertising, and that remaining space is called the news hole. That's the space where the editors and the reporters fill the space with news stories. So as you look at the statistic here, if you were to take, let's say, if you were to look at a week's worth of a major New York newspaper like the New York Times, and you were to look at every page and sort of average the impressions together, then what you would find is that on average, on any page of the paper, about 40% of that page is filled with news and information. The remaining 60% would be filled with advertising. And I know that in some instances you would find some pages with no ads. You might find some pages that have an entire page of advertising. So again, I'm talking about on average. About 40% is the news hole, and what goes into the news hole is determined by a gatekeeper. After we went through that period of sensationalism in the Pulitzer and Hearst years of the late 1890s, the late 1800s particularly, in the 1890s, Americans were ready for something different in the news. And just simply put, a new method, a new approach to reporting news was established. We can call it a model. We'll call it the model of objectivity. And we use that term objectivity as opposed to subjectivity. And what it means is simply that news, we expect news to be reported to us as accurate, truthful, and most importantly, without any bias. Each one of us as individuals, we all have our own sets of biases. Some may pertain to our political beliefs, our religious beliefs, maybe our viewpoints about financial matters. Each one of us probably are a little bit different in our biases. But ever since we got beyond the awful days of sensationalism, one thing that characterizes the news media of the United States, and now I'm talking about not only newspaper, but radio, television, and online, is that we have this expectation that the news that is reported to us is accurate and unbiased. Now, it's not humanly possible to remove all bias in the way that stories are reported, but just understand that that is the expectation today. You pick up an American newspaper today, and on any page that you look, with the exception of one page, and I'll come back to that in just a moment, you should have the expectation that the information that you read there in those news stories is just as accurate and free of reporter opinion and bias as it possibly can be made. Newspapers and later broadcast stations have set aside time and space for the expression of opinions, but one thing to understand about that is that page or pages of a newspaper are always very clearly labeled, generally up at the top of the page, that what you're reading on that page or those pages is the expression of opinion. So there is that part of the newspaper where objectivity is not practiced, but on all of the other pages, you should expect the reporting to be objective. One of the things, of course, that accounts for the behavior of journalists in reporting news is the idea of ethnocentrism. We, as citizens of the United States, are considered to be ethnocentric. Ethnocentric in that we're more interested about and centered on our ethnicity and things that are happening in the United States than what is going on perhaps in other parts of the world. And that's a result of the individual values that each journalist possesses and brings with her or him to the job. But the fact is, and you might have noticed this before, maybe so in other forms of news coverage besides newspapers, but sadly, if there is a horrific plane crash somewhere in a third world nation and persons perish in that plane crash but are not citizens of the United States, yeah, that story is news, but it typically doesn't get reported on the front page of an American newspaper. As the saying goes, it sometimes gets placed, on the back pages. It is newsworthy, but it's not the important news. Now, if a similar plane were to crash somewhere in the United States, and sadly there's similar loss of life of American citizens, well, you can pretty well rest assured that that story, because of its proximity, because of its closeness to persons in America, that will be considered front page news. So that's an example of how ethnocentrism plays out in news coverage in America. And I think we want to think about wrapping up our discussion today about the watchdog function of the mass media. The watchdog function is an idea that was first expressed over probably 100 years ago. The American journalism movement, regardless of whether it's in newspapering or broadcast or online, one of the major responsibilities of journalists is to perform what is called the watchdog function. Watchdog in the sense of paying attention to what is happening at government at all its various levels, from federal to state government to county government and local, and to observe what is going on there as a watchdog would. And then when something important comes up that is important enough for us to know about, us as just the regular citizens, then the newspaper or the TV station or radio station will report that information to us. It's the watchdog function. It's a well understood idea that the role of journalist journalist plural, is to keep an eye on what's happening in the world for us. For an example, think about if you're wanting to follow what is happening in the presidency. It's not possible for you, nor me, nor any other average citizen to just go drop in on the president in the Oval Office and find out, what's happening in the world today, Mr. President, or Ms. President for that matter, which I suspect will happen somewhere in the near future. We can't do that. We don't have that kind of access, but reporters can. One person can, acting as a journalist, observe what is happening in the halls of government and then write stories that can be shared with thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of people. So that's the idea of the watchdog function that the press performs, as it's explained on pages 212 and 13. Let's wrap up today. Gosh, and it's hard to believe that it's already time for us to be thinking about Exam 1. Exam 1, as well as the other 2 exams in this course, all 3 of your exams will be taken on Moodle. Even when we get to that part of the semester where we are able to meet face-to-face, our exams still all will be on Moodle, and they are all available during the 50-minute period for this class. So the login can begin at the top of the hour, and then 50 minutes later, the exam will close. Look for that information about the exam on Moodle. I'm going to ask you to consider the wisdom of taking your exam in a campus lab as opposed to maybe at home or some other location, because when you take an exam online, You can have problems with your computer. You can have problems with your internet connection. And if you're doing this in a campus lab, there will be people who proctor and monitor the labs that can give you assistance with a computer problem or a connectivity problem, and you won't lose out on the opportunity to take the exam. And then a final reminder, and that is that there is a study guide for each of the exams, including Exam 1. The link is on Moodle in the week preceding the exam. And so I would encourage you to click that link and download the study guide and use that. Use that along with the notes that you have taken, along with the information that you've learned from watching the videos and the information that you've learned from reading the chapters in the textbook. All of that represents the information that you'll be tested on in Exam 1. So, let's think about this. Nonstop news coverage is well established, but what impact does it have on the way people interpret the facts and truth of news stories? I think if you think about this question and you can formulate an intelligent answer to this question, then I think that represents that you have a pretty good understanding of the information that I've tried to present to you in Chapter 8. This question won't be on the exam. It's strictly out there to prompt you into a mode of thinking, just to see how well you're understanding the information that I'm presenting to you. Good luck on Exam 1. We'll see you in the next section next week.